Have you ever wondered if the story we learn about the first woman truly reveals the whole truth? What if I told you that Eve might not have been the first woman created by God? What if, hidden between the lines of Scripture, there is a forgotten figure, a mysterious being whose name echoes like a whisper among ancient Jewish texts and lost interpretations of creation? Her name is Lilith. And today, we will dive into a mystery that challenges centuries of tradition and casts new light on the first chapters of the Bible. Prepare yourself for a journey through ancient manuscripts, Hebrew language, and theological reflections that will forever change the way you read Genesis. Because maybe, just maybe, Eve was not the first woman. And that changes everything. From the very first verses of the Bible, the creation of humanity is described with reverence and complexity. In Genesis 1, we see God creating man and woman in his image, in a single moment, an act of balance and equality. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. It's a powerful, complete, universal statement. God creates both together, man and woman, without mention of ribs or one being formed after the other. In this text, both seem to emerge simultaneously, formed from the same essence, in full equality. But then, in Genesis 2, everything changes. The tone becomes more intimate, almost narrative. God forms man from the dust of the ground, plants a garden called Eden, and only later realizes that it is not good for the man to be alone. The woman in this second account does not arise from the same dust, nor at the same moment. She is taken from the man's side, from a rib, as it is commonly translated. This difference between the two chapters of Genesis is not a mere detail. It's a crack in the traditional narrative. For centuries, scholars, rabbis, theologians, and mystics have tried to explain this apparent contradiction. And among the answers, one figure stands out: Lilith. Lilith is not directly mentioned in the book of Genesis, but her presence is felt in ancient texts like the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a Jewish work from the 8th or 9th century CE. In it, Lilith is presented as Adam's first wife, created at the same time and from the same substance as he was. She refuses to submit and abandons Eden, rejecting life under Adam's dominion. It's a story of equality, conflict, and exile. God, then, would have created Eve, not from the same dust but from Adam's own body, as a more submissive and receptive companion. This alternative narrative of Lilith was later demonized by many traditions, becoming a symbol of seduction, nocturnal danger, and disobedience. But behind the myth lies an important theological question. Why are there two different accounts of the creation of woman in the Bible? One that suggests equality and simultaneity, and another that introduces hierarchy and derivation. And could the mysterious wife of Cain, mentioned in Genesis 4, be an echo of this untold story? Before we go deeper, take a deep breath. This video is for those who are not afraid to go beyond the surface, for those who seek to understand the word with depth and courage. If you feel like you're about to discover something that will open your spiritual eyes, subscribe to the channel now. Activate the notification bell to not miss any content, and leave a like if you love diving into the truth of the scriptures. Now let's return to the story. In Genesis 2:21-22, we read that God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep and took one of his ribs to form the woman. But the Hebrew word used here is not rib in the strict sense. The word is tsela, which also means side, lateral, or half. In other parts of the Bible, this same word is used to describe the sides of the tabernacle, the sides of the Ark of the Covenant, and even the chambers of the temple. This has led some scholars to suggest that instead of God merely taking a rib, he may have divided Adam in half, forming the woman from half of his original structure. In this understanding, the woman would not be a secondary extension, but an integral part, a symbolic separation of an originally androgynous being. And this brings us back to Genesis 1, where man and woman are created together, without separation, without sequence. This view has deep echoes in mystical Jewish traditions, such as the Zohar, where the first human is described as a dual being, later divided. Eve, then, is not merely a later creation, but an expression of something that already existed in unity with Adam. This would also explain the poetry in the man's words upon seeing her. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He does not see her as another creature, but as himself reconfigured. But if Eve appears in Genesis 2, and man and woman are created together in Genesis 1, who is the woman of that first chapter? This is where Lilith enters. As a theological hypothesis and mythological character, the rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash already wondered about this forgotten woman, and the fact that Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, finds a wife shortly after his exile, without the Bible mentioning the birth of any daughters of Adam until later chapters, fuels this doubt even further. Who was Cain's wife? Genesis 4:16-17 says, "Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch." But where did this woman come from? The narrative does not explain, it simply assumes her existence. There is no mention of sisters or other children that could logically justify her origin within Adam and Eve's direct lineage. For many, this is evidence that there were already people outside of Eden, perhaps descendants of an earlier or parallel creation, as in Genesis 1. This possibility lends strength to the pre-Adamite theory, which suggests that God created human beings before Adam and Eve, and that the couple in Eden was a special creation made with a purpose of covenant. Eve in this scenario would be the first woman of the redemptive lineage, not necessarily the first woman of all humanity, but the first woman chosen by God to give rise to the lineage that would lead to Noah, Abraham, David, and ultimately Jesus. This distinction changes everything, because if Eve was chosen, not for being the only one, but for being part of the divine plan, then her identity gains even greater spiritual weight. She represents the beginning of a redemptive journey, the seed of an eternal promise, not just the start of human biology. And in this case, Lilith, Cain's wife, and other possible women indirectly mentioned in the biblical narrative belong to another plane, perhaps forgotten, perhaps omitted, but not necessarily contradictory. The mystery of Cain's wife, as well as the possible existence of other human beings outside Eden, raises an even more intriguing question. What if the focus of the scriptures was never to record the entire history of humanity, but only the spiritual lineage that would culminate in the Messiah? What if the Bible intentionally ignored certain figures because they were not part of the covenant line? This possibility invites us to look at Genesis with new eyes, not as a book of universal genealogy, but as a sacred document that narrates God's redemptive plan from the beginning. It is at this point that Eve's identity becomes even more relevant. In Genesis 3:20, after the fall, Adam names her Eve, Chava in Hebrew, because she would be the mother of all living. This phrase is often used as evidence that she was the first woman, but let's look closely. The term used for living is chayim, a word that does not necessarily mean all of humanity, but life in a spiritual and continuous sense. In other words, Eve could be the mother not of every human being who ever existed, but of all those who would inherit the plan of life that God established after the fall. The focus of the biblical narrative was never the entirety of creation, but the thread that leads to salvation. The Bible is silent about nations outside Abraham's lineage, about cities that do not play a part in the messianic trajectory, and about peoples who do not influence Israel's history. Thus, it would be consistent for it to also leave out of focus human beings who were not part of the covenant plan. This does not invalidate the text. On the contrary, it reinforces its purpose, to guide us to Christ. This is why some ancient scholars, like Augustine, argued that the two creation accounts in Genesis are complementary. Genesis 1 would present the spiritual and general creation of humanity, while Genesis 2 would detail the physical formation of Adam and Eve as representatives of a new covenant. Others, like the theologian Origen, even suggested that the first human was a spiritual entity, later clothed in flesh. Meanwhile, Gnostic writings, such as the Apocryphon of John, offer even bolder versions, presenting two Eves, one celestial and perfect, the other earthly and vulnerable. Even if we do not accept these readings as doctrine, they reveal something essential. Since the earliest centuries, theologians and scholars have recognized that there are more layers to the creation story than meets the eye. And Lilith, in this context, becomes the symbol of a hidden narrative, perhaps suppressed but present as a shadow in the spiritual tradition. Returning to the figure of Lilith, we find her only possible mention in the Bible, in Isaiah 34:14. The text says, "Wild animals will meet with hyenas, the satyr will call to its mate, there too Lilith will rest and find a place of repose." Some translations prefer night creature or screech owl, but in the original Hebrew, the word used is literally Lilith. Although the text does not directly describe her as the first woman, her presence in a context of judgment, desolation, and spiritual creatures suggests that Lilith was recognized as a mysterious and dangerous being. In later Jewish traditions, she becomes a nocturnal entity associated with the death of children, seduction, and spiritual rebellion. But the origin of this fear may have stemmed from her rejection of submission, something that, in ancient culture, was seen as a grave sin. Lilith, then, can be interpreted as the archetypal shadow of the untamed woman, the one who chose freedom over obedience. And for that, she was demonized. If we think about it, the very structure of Genesis 1 and 2 already shows two different approaches to humanity. One universal and egalitarian, the other relational and hierarchical. In chapter 1, God creates everything by His word. Let there be light. Let there be a firmament. Let there be life. But in Genesis 2, He forms man with His hands, breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, plants a garden, and walks in Eden. It's a shift in tone that reminds us that the text is not concerned only with the how, but with the why. The creation of Eve from Adam's side can be read as both submission and deep communion, depending on the lens through which we read. And if Eve was the woman of the covenant, the one God chose to be part of His eternal plan, that changes the question. It's no longer, was Eve the first woman? But why was Eve the chosen one? Eve's story is not just about origin, but about purpose. That's why the Bible does not provide details about Cain's wife. That's why other peoples are not named before Abraham. Because the focus of the narrative is the lineage that leads to Christ. This means that the Scripture's silence about other possible women is not omission, but theological intentionality. Eve is the woman whose womb would carry the seed of redemption. It was not a biological choice. It was a spiritual choice. And here we return to the key phrase, mother of all living. Eve is not just a mother because she gave birth. She's a mother because she inaugurated the story that would lead to the birth of Jesus. This reading aligns with how the New Testament interprets Old Testament figures. Paul calls Abraham the father of all who believe, even though biologically he is not the ancestor of many peoples. Mary is called blessed among women because, like Eve, she was chosen to bear the Messiah. There is a spiritual line that runs through the Bible, and Eve is the earthly starting point of that line. It's fascinating to realize that while Lilith's name fades from the biblical canon, Eve's name endures, not just as a character, but as a symbol. Her story is that of the fallible human who falls, but is also the target of promise. In Genesis 3:15, God announces that from the woman will come the one who will crush the serpent's head. This promise is not made directly to Adam. It is made to the woman, to her lineage. Eve, therefore, becomes the prototype of hope. And even with all the complexity of her origin, with debates about her primacy, her ultimate role is undeniable. She is the beginning of God's redemptive plan. If Lilith represents the woman who was forgotten, Eve is the woman who was remembered. And that tells us a lot about what truly matters in the biblical text. The focus was never on who came first. The focus was always on who was called. And perhaps in that calling lies Eve's true glory. When we read Eve's story carefully, we realize that her importance lies not only in her birth, but in her destiny. Eve is not just a name on the first pages of the Bible, she is a symbolic key. The first woman to enter into covenant with the God who redeems, the bearer of the promise that would span generations, endure the flood, survive slavery in Egypt, withstand exile in Babylon, and finally find its fulfillment in the womb of another woman named Mary. That's why the question that truly matters is not, was Eve the first woman on earth, but rather, why did God begin his story of redemption with her? When we look at the text with the eyes of the heart and the rigor of investigation, we realize that there are multiple layers in the biblical narrative, layers that do not cancel each other out, but complement one another. Genesis 1 speaks of the creation of humanity, man and woman, in a simultaneous, universal, cosmic way. Genesis 2, on the other hand, speaks of the formation of Adam and then Eve, in an intimate, symbolic, relational way. These two stories are not contradictory. They are two angles of the same reality, a humanity created by God and a lineage set apart by him to carry a covenant. Eve, then, is the first woman of the lineage of the promise, the first to carry not just a biological seed, but a prophetic destiny. And if there was another woman before her, Lilith or any other figure forgotten in the dark corners of tradition, that woman may have been part of an earlier creation, a humanity without covenant, a people without alliance. The Bible does not condemn them, but it also does not mention them, because the focus is on the line that leads to salvation. This same structure is visible throughout Scripture. God chooses Abraham among many peoples. He chooses Israel among many nations. He chooses David among many brothers. He chooses Mary among many women. And before them all, he chose Eve. The lineage of redemption begins with her. And here is something even more powerful. Eve is not exalted for her perfection. Quite the opposite. She's remembered precisely for her fall, for her pain, for her humanity. The Bible shows her as someone who erred, who listened to the serpent, who offered the forbidden fruit to her husband. But even so, God does not reject her. He clothes her. He speaks to her. And he chooses her to be the beginning of the greatest story ever told. God does not begin his work with perfect beings. He begins with the imperfect ones he can transform. Eve is not just the first woman, she is the first redeemed. And that makes her a symbol of humanity as a whole, fallen but rescued. And if, as we've explored here, Lilith existed as a mythological, symbolic, or even literal figure, her rejection of submission was not just an act of independence, but a refusal of the divine plan. Not because she was a woman, but because she did not want to be part of the story God was writing. Eve, even in her fall, remained in the narrative. And that is what matters most. Cain's wife, on the other hand, remains a mystery. She appears without a name, without a clear origin. Perhaps she came from outside Eden. Perhaps she is part of a forgotten humanity, a story the Bible did not wish to tell because it did not lead to the cross. And here we understand the silence of the Scriptures, the absence of names, records, details, because God only records what is within his covenant. What lies outside remains in the shadows. This pattern invites us to reflect. What is our place in the story? Are we among the named or the forgotten? Is our life connected to the spiritual lineage that leads to Christ? Or are we like the nameless wife, present, but outside the eternal purpose? Eve's story challenges us. It shows that it doesn't matter where we come from. What matters is whether we are willing to be part of what God is building. The covenant is not about perfection, it's about surrender. Perhaps Eve was not the first in chronological order. Perhaps there were other women before her. But it was with her that God began to write the story of salvation. It was in her that he planted the promise. It was through her that the one who would crush the serpent's head would come. And that is enough. The biblical narrative is like a map. It doesn't show every detail. It doesn't speak of every people. It doesn't answer every question. But it shows a path. A golden thread that begins in Eden, passes through Eve, crosses Cain's story, survives the flood, is preserved by patriarchs, defended by prophets, carried by priests, until it finds its fullness in Jesus. When we understand this, we realize that the Bible does not omit out of ignorance. It omits by purpose, and in that purpose Eve has a unique role. So the next time you open Genesis, remember, there is more behind every word. There are layers of revelation, echoes of forgotten stories, silences full of meaning. And there is a woman named Eve, who was not just the first, but the chosen one. If this video stirred something within you, if it made you see the Bible with new eyes, leave a comment. We want to know, do you believe Eve was the first woman created or the first woman of the covenant? And if you want to keep diving into mysteries like this, about Lilith, the pre-Adamites, the Nephilim, Eden, and the enigmas of the Old Testament, subscribe to the channel now, activate notifications, share this content with those who love to investigate the scriptures in depth, because the truth is hidden, but accessible to those who choose to seek. Until the next biblical dive. And remember, not everything is on the surface. God hides the most precious treasures in the depths of the text. It's up to us to dig,